Now, it's very common that when our realization becomes more stable, deeply, we become more established as being that consciousness, that aware presence. Once that sort of really begins to sink in very, very deeply, once we become established in that, usually what we're become established in is life beyond ego. We've transcended ego. We've transcended the desire for power, for control, the resistance, the grabbing. This would be a very, very deep realization now, a really deep realization beyond ego. Once that movement beyond ego has completed itself, then you could say in a religious way of speaking about this that our will and God's will become the same. So much so that there doesn't seem to be a difference or any separation at all between what we are and what the divine is, what the divine impulse is. This is actually a union of wills, we could say. The will of God, you could also say the will of life, the will of existence, and one's own experience of will unifies. So it's one will, one movement. And this is, of course, a quite spiritually mature person. This is usually something that's quite beyond somebody that simply had a deep moment of spiritual clarity. This is usually something that will develop out of that with time. Rarely does it just happen all in one instant, because generally ego does not give up quite that easily. But once the energies of ego start to dissipate, once they become harmonized with the universal, once they've dissolved into spirit, you could say, this is what in many spiritual traditions would be called a type of union. Because we internally feel a deep, deep, deep unification. There does not feel to be a division. As I said, your will and God's will, life's will and your will are one will. And when there's a union of will, there doesn't seem to be necessarily a separate self. But more often than not, self is actually still operating. What this really is something that's beyond ego. This isn't really something I want to go into with great depth right now. I'm just using these various phases of spiritual awakening to point out the importance and the growing importance of understanding what spiritual awakening is all about, that it's really about the surrendering of self. Now, at some point, and you never know at what point, once we've had this sort of union, this experience of oneness, self will also begin to, well, not just begin, but at some point self itself, if I may say it that way, begins to disappear or disappears entirely. Rarely does self disappear entirely all at once, although it can happen. But if you look at the overall arc of what spiritual awakening is, the whole overall arc is an actual disappearing of the various aspects and energies of self. When we have an initial awakening, which is usually beyond ego, then we establish ourselves at some point in a consciousness which is beyond the energies of ego. And so that's a certain aspect, ego is a certain aspect of self. We could, as I said earlier, we could call that lower self. And one has surrendered those aspects of lower self. One has surrendered ego, which is, I'm making it sound like it's rather fundamental or rudimentary, I should say, but actually it's not rudimentary at all. It's something that is much rarer than even to have a moment of spiritual awakening. Lots of people can have moments of spiritual awakening, legitimate, transformative, beautiful moments of spiritual awakening, but not many of them will really take that to its natural conclusion, will actually see that even the awakening is not something for them. It's not something to grab. It's actually a space. It's actually that into which we can actually surrender ourselves more and more and more and more and more and more and more. But from the very beginning, the whole of spirituality is actually a moving beyond self. And you experience this moving beyond self. You can experience the dropping away of the certain energies of self. When the ego is really transcended and the ego and the energies of ego really start to dissipate, you will feel that the motivating energies that are centered around ego, around attachment and aversion, start to dissipate, start to disappear. And it's only when these energies start to dissipate and disappear that do we realize how much of our lives were motivated by these very sort of egoic drives, this sort of egoic will, because will is an energy, will is a drive. It's what I want and what I don't want. And only as it really begins to dissipate do we even have any kind of real understanding about what this egoic energy was to begin with. But people often start to notice a certain diminishment in what we could call the personal will at a fairly early part of their spirituality. It may be a small diminishment, but the arc, the direction that spirituality is really meant to move actually starts relatively early. That will only increase, that kind of letting go will only increase the deeper our realization goes as we proceed.